Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about using board games in the classroom and how to develop good board games for classroom use. My major conclusion here, if you don't want to sit through the whole presentation, is that games don't have to be fair to be effective learning tools. Um, Also, I need to apologize for not being here in person. I just took a new position and couldn't use the vacation days to get here for a Thursday presentation. That being said, I'll have my email at the end, and you can email me any questions or any prototypes for board games you're working on for archaeological classroom use, and I will be more than happy to comment on them. Briefly, I want to talk about what I'm going to cover in this talk. I'm going to cover a brief history of the kind of board games you can and should take inspiration from. How, unlike in research, stealing is okay, and that's what the professionals actually do. They steal mechanics from each other. I'm going to have a quick conversation about fairness and balance in classroom games. And then finally, I'm going to talk about why good games should be used in archaeological classrooms. So, briefly, I'm going to run you through what I think of as the different time periods of games. So, when I was thinking about this presentation, I realized that some people may have not played games kind of throughout the history of board gaming. And so I want to briefly talk about what I see as the various periods of board game creation. And so, of course, I did, as I mentioned, what any good archaeologist would do, and I assigned these pieces of material culture to periods that I made up without consulting anybody. Nonetheless, I will go through each of them because I think each different period in board gaming has different things to offer or not offer to someone seeking to develop board games for classroom teaching and learning. So imagine me jumping upon a soapbox, and I'm going to get a little critical here for a second. I'm going to talk about the early days of board games, which I've titled here The Dark Ages. Games like Monopoly are over 100 years old. Parcheesi is just terrible. And whatever game this Egyptian D20 comes from sounds cool, but we don't know how to play it. So I would avoid taking inspiration from games written in the early 20th century, things like Monopoly, Parcheesi, that kind of thing. Ancient games like Go, chess, checkers, you can find inspiration there, but for the most part, they're not set up for teaching and learning, and the mechanics are super novel. But what I'm saying is don't use games from the 50s and 60s. They are honestly mostly just bad and random and have very few unique mechanics. Using these games would be the equivalent to me of doing field archaeology without screening, right? The new period of board game creation has just led to amazing mechanics and things that can be leveraged and used in the classroom. And frankly, the games that come before them don't. They're dominated by randomness, and honestly, most of them have little to no player agency. All right, I've said my piece. I'll jump off my soapbox and continue with surveying the time periods of board game creation. Here I've labeled the 1970s to the 1990s as what I'm calling here the pre-Euro invasion. Some people affectionately, I think, and some people derogatorily refer to these games as Ameritrash because they took place before European games came over to the US, even though a lot of these games are actually written in Britain. But I think there's a lot of value in these games. And my example game that I'm going to talk about here is called Kingmaker. It's a board game where you fight out the War of the Roses. What's pictured here is the new version that just came out last year. It's kind of my family game. When the Williamses get together, there's a good chance that we're going to throw down Kingmaker, and it's going to be very serious. The way this game works is your playing pieces are various noble families represented by a lead noble, and you deal them out. And your goal is to capture either the Lancastrian or Yorkist heir, crown them, which requires two bishops or one archbishop, and then eliminate entirely the other line so that you have the sole monarch of Britain. To start the game off, though, you get dealt an unfair situation to simulate the War of the Roses. You get a series of nobles, archbishops, mercenaries, things like that that represent your troops. Pictured here on the far right is a really good opening hand. You have the Earl of Warwick, for whom the game is named, the actual Kingmaker. But the interesting thing is, as you play, the more important your nobles become, the more they get thrown and teleported around the board. And that's when they get teleported and isolated, that's when you can jump on them and defeat them in a battle. So, despite the fact that you start with an unfair situation, the game has this internal balancing mechanism, which is frankly really clever. So, I think there's a lot to learn from these games from the 1970s and 1990s. Another great example is the original Dune board game because they had asymmetry. They had unbalanced situations, and yet they provided interesting scenarios which you could leverage mechanics from or an entire game of and still make really interesting classroom board game activities. So now we come to a turning point in board game history that I call the Euro invasion. You simply can't talk about board games without talking about the vanguard of the Euro invasion, Settlers of Catan. It brought a lot of people to the table. This style of game is the rules are more simple, but it's still a complex experience. And this is probably the biggest takeaway from this style of game that we should be using in our classroom is that we need simple rules because we need to present these in 50 to an hour and 20 minutes and make sure that every player, every student feels involved. So that's the biggest lesson to be taken away from this. Randomness mostly affects everyone, the exception in Settlers being getting to move the robber. Everybody has a chance to be affected by that randomness. Competition is indirect. It's not a war game like most of the games in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's definitely still the most dominant form of board games written for adults. You can still find them, and there are several modern examples. Likely, this is the kind of game most people are basing their classroom games on. A lot of elder millennials and Gen X individuals came into gaming via this game or games like it. Other examples that you can look at for mechanics are Ticket to Ride, Wingspan, and my personal favorite, Everdell. Okay, so I'm going to spend a bit more time on this slide because I think this board game and the ones that have come from it are really important. And I think folks that want to make creative teaching and learning board games in archaeology or any discipline really need to play this game. Now, keep in mind, Euro style games are still going strong. One of the most popular games going right now is Wingspan, and I would clearly put it in the Euro genre. But erupting out of a single board game written by Dr. Cole Worley is this new idea that harkens back to some of the concepts in the 70s and 90s, but does them having learned the lessons from the Euro invasion. And the game you have to talk about when you're talking about this was written by Dr. Cole Worley, which is Root. Root is unbalanced, unfair. Each faction, each player is almost playing a different game, and there are very few common mechanics between them. So it is not fair or balanced, and the designer doesn't care. He doesn't want it to be fair or balanced. He wants it to be fun. The balance issues are known. The one in the base game, the one character plays a single model called the Vagabond, and a common statement when playing Root is remember to kick the trash panda because the little model is indicated on the board by a raccoon. And that's to remind the players who know how to play that if we don't occasionally bother the player playing the Vagabond, they will inevitably win. So you kind of have to randomly attack them. This game is a very complex war game. It is very difficult to teach because everybody's doing different things. And it is camouflaged with cute critters. I couldn't help but include my very favorite card art in probably any board game, which is the ambush card pictured there with the bunny burning the village. All the little meeples are very cute. The little pieces are very cute. A wonderful game. So I recommend that if you're going to start writing board games for classroom use, you play it. Luckily, you don't have to get the physical version. I know as archaeologists, you'll be tempted to get the material culture version, the material object. There's a digital version that allows you to play by yourself or with people online and will actually teach you to play. But why this is so important and what I haven't yet been able to do but want to do so badly is start to design asymmetrical learning and teaching games that effectively a game does not need to be balanced to be a good lesson. And in thinking about that, when we're only given 50 minutes or an hour and a half or something like that to let our students play a game, you could actually play an asymmetrical game with different sides multiple times, allowing players or students to take on different roles and learn different things. I think moving forward, when I develop classroom games, this is going to be a major inspiration for me. There are other versions of it. If you're more nautically minded, there's a new version that kind of runs on the same engine, not written by the same person, but the same company called Ahoy. This game is absolutely incredible. You need to go play it. It reminds us that things don't need to be fair and that you can play asymmetrical games. Continuing to talk about Dr. Worley, I refer to him as Dr. Worley because I believe he has a PhD in history. When he was interviewed about Root, he stated the following. And so whenever we're working on a new game, even when we are working on the new Root expansion, there are moments where I have to say like, okay, what we're doing here is making the game less interesting and more balanced. But actually, what we need to do is make it sharper. And this is a really important quote. Games don't have to be fair to teach a lesson. And in fact, I think games that aren't fair sometimes teach lessons that stick better. We have this preconceived notion that when we're writing games, it needs to be a fair game. That comes from the Euro invasion, where most games are fair, and just our common sense of competition from sports and other avenues of life. But when you're writing a board game to teach a lesson, its goal is to teach the lesson and be interesting enough to engage your students, not to be a fair competition. Dr. Worley gets that. I think everybody who designs board games for the classroom needs to understand that. So this leads me to a really important point, which is that you should be, if you're going to develop board games for the classroom, you need to be playing the board games developed by professionals and stealing mechanics. Don't do it in research, obviously, but you can totally steal board game mechanics. Even the professionals do it. When I bought Twilight Imperium, my very favorite board game, the third edition in college, I was shocked when I was reading the foreword and I found out that the author, Christian T. Peterson, openly admitted to stealing mechanics from other games and even called out the games he had stolen them from. Board game mechanics have been really hard to copyright or trademark, and they do it all the time. So in this case, I'm giving you the same advice that I give to people new to running RPGs, another type of board game, is that you don't have to be original, just be entertaining. And in this case, I'll adapt it a bit more to say you don't have to be original, you just need to be entertaining and achieve your learning objective, right? So play these games, steal their mechanics. Ultimately, in my over 30 years of playing board games and my over 10 years of using board games in the classroom, I've learned the following things. Board games are good for archaeology classrooms because it's difficult and costly to get students into the field. Anytime we can simulate something with a hands-on experience is wonderful. If you want to write good classroom board games, you have to play or at least watch people play good board games. Turns out there are a lot of people playing board games on YouTube, and you don't even have to own them to understand the game. Archaeologists want more archaeological board games. Despite my wonderful work on lithics and Clovis, my board game publications are the most cited and viewed on academia. The kinds of students who play these board games are the kinds of students that make great archaeologists. They're strategically minded, they're used to dealing with complex situations, and typically they have a mind for logic and quantitative reasoning. When writing a good classroom board game, you need to think about the following factors. Do I want the game to be balanced? Does it need to be? How much randomness? Should the randomness affect one player or a group of players at a time or everyone? Are the lessons part of the game mechanics, or can I ask questions about the metagame? How much player agency is there? Side note, sometimes you can just have the illusion of player agency and actually their choices don't matter. Thank you to the organizers and everybody for being here. Please email me any question or respective board game idea to justinpatrickwilliams@gmail.com. And again, all the board games show here are copyright or trademarked or something like that by their creators or owners. I don't own any of them. Thanks so much.